Let's speak to Mark Galeotti, a Russia expert, Sunday Times columnist and former Foreign Office advisor. Mark, good evening to you.
Hello there.
Do we whisper it quietly that there are more encouraging noises on a Ukraine peace deal from different quarters than there have been, perhaps at any point during the last few years?
Yeah, it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas. I mean, I think we still need to be cautious because we also had the statement that said that 90% of the issues have been sorted, which may well be true, but the 10% that remains are very thorny ones. But the interesting thing is that really, if one thinks about it, the two crucial ones, which looked as if they could derail the process, were security guarantees for Ukraine and the territorial issue. In other words, Putin's demand that Ukraine surrender portions, the unconquered portions of Donetsk region. Now, the Europeans are saying that they've now sort of sketched out security guarantees. We have no idea, though, if those will be acceptable to Putin. And there's no sense yet that Zelensky is willing to give up that strategically crucial territory. So I still feel that we got two crucial issues that aren't being sorted yet. But everything else is working out and the atmospherics are very positive. So we can always cross our fingers and hope we're getting somewhere.
Yeah, and one would hope that actually the time and energy being exuded by Steve Witkoff, the US envoy, and Jared Kushner, and indeed European leaders, indicates that they're not doing it just for the optics, that there needs to be an end in sight to this. It's just trying to get a better understanding of, what does security guarantees look like? We hear from this White House official that they are prepared to offer a NATO-like Article 5 guarantee as part of a security guarantee package, that they think Russia will accept that. But what does security guarantees mean? How do you interpret them? What is the best guess on that, Mark?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, it's worth noting Article 5, the NATO Article 5 guarantee, it gets held up as the sort of gold standard security guarantee. Actually, if you look at the text, it's really quite woolly. It just simply says that if a member nation is attacked, other states will respond appropriately. Now, appropriately could mean sending a mechanized brigade, or it could be sending a particularly stiffly worded diplomatic communique. So again, there is a danger of getting seduced by these terms. Now, what the European leaders today, this evening, are claiming is that they have put together a package which would actually include European or coalition of the willing forces on Ukrainian soil, planes in the air if need be to defend its airspace, and also operating within the Black Sea. So in other words, actually, a commitment of troops as well as money to ensure that Ukraine can maintain large armed forces of its own and such like. Now, that would definitely be a major step forward if that were actually to be accepted by the Americans, because we should note this is although they claim that the US is also on side, this is a European statement, but also by the Russians. So I think we are getting closer. But when it comes down to it, the Ukrainians aren't going to trust fine words. They feel they've heard these before. What they actually want from the West is a very, very specific set of measures. So we'll have to see if what we get is that very, very specific idea, because otherwise the Ukrainians aren't going to budge.
And the US would be a part of these security guarantees. That's certainly what the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz added earlier, that the US had offered considerable security guarantees. But does that mean, I mean, if you're talking about commitment in the air, it is roundly understood, I could be wrong on this, Mark, that actually the US would have to have a part in that, because they by far and away are the best qualified. They have the kit available to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but on the other hand, I mean, we have seen Trump be very, very leery about getting involved. Again, it's this usual sort of tug of war. The Europeans want the Americans to be sort of involved at the sharp end. The Americans want to say, well, look, the Europeans will do any actual fighting. We will provide what are called the enablers. So the intelligence support, the electronic warfare, again, things that the Americans can do very, very well indeed, but that don't actually involve putting your soldiers into harm's way. So again, this is one of the things which we really need sort of fleshed out. But what I would note is the European statement also suggests that actually Americans would be involved in leading the sort of the monitoring operation. So in other words, if the Russians do cross the border or start shelling across the border, that it'll be the Americans who are responsible for actually sort of pointing this out and pointing the finger of blame. And again, if the Americans are willing to go along with this, I think that would also help reassure the Ukrainians.
On territory, the AFP reported earlier that Americans still want Ukraine to see control of the eastern Donetsk and Luhansk regions. The Ukrainian negotiator sort of poo-pooed that a little bit. I mean, one thing is sure that Volodymyr Zelensky will not concede all of the Donbass, but are we any clearer? Are you any clearer, Mark, about where this might land?
Well, look, at the moment, Zelensky is trying to avoid giving any kind of commitments. I mean, he said, well, we could put it to a referendum, which is not going to fly. The Russians aren't going to stop the war in the hope that Ukrainians all vote to hand Russia a free prize. Also, Zelensky has suggested that this would actually be illegal under the Ukrainian constitution, which is questionable because we're not talking about handing legal right. It's just simply an admission that, OK, fine, this territory is now de facto, in practice, in Russian control. This is the one area that I was glancing at the Russian sort of first reactions in their media this evening. This is one area where they have zeroed in and they said, look, we're still not hearing any sense of Ukrainian flexibility on this because we have no flexibility at all. This could be very high stakes bargaining. It could be that Putin's waiting for the 11th hour and 59th minute to say, OK, I will concede on this really important point. What are you going to give me in terms of sanctions relief or the like? But he's certainly not signalling any give at the moment, which is why I still feel that is one of the most insoluble obstacles to actually getting anywhere.
We've heard from Russia that they're open to the idea of Ukraine joining the EU. Similarly, Ukraine are prepared to step away from any immediate ambition to join NATO. Do those elements both make sense to you? I wonder if this is Russia playing into the hands of the United States, who in their national security plan completely rubbished the work of the EU and suggested that 4 or 5 more nations may want to leave it.
Well, I think this shows one of those perverse convergences between Putin and Trump, in that Trump sees the EU as a kind of a dangerous force that is trying to undermine American trade hegemony in the world. Putin sees the EU as essentially a pointless waste of time. I mean, so as far as he's concerned, yes, he's quite happy to see Ukraine incorporated.
Have it. Go on, have it. Absolutely fine.
Because as far as he's concerned, it would just be disruptive, because it's perfectly true. I mean, it's not just the well-known issues to do with, for example, corruption and such like. It's that, for example, Poland has been very, very supportive of Ukraine's fight against Russian imperialism. But on the other hand, Polish farmers blocked roadways precisely to keep Ukrainian agricultural product out because of the low wages, the low standards being applied in Ukrainian agriculture and so forth. What that would mean is Ukraine becomes a massive drain on EU members' budgets. So I think from Putin's point of view, just as he's not that impressed by Zelensky saying we'll give up on NATO membership because Ukraine wasn't going to join NATO, that had been made fairly clear. But also he's perfectly willing to say, there you go, enjoy trying to reincorporate Ukraine and build it up to EU levels, because he thinks that actually it would help really torpedo the whole European project.
Look, thank you so much for speaking to us, Mark. I have a note here and it just says book plug. I don't know what the book is, but share it with us, please do.
Well, my most recent, it came out just last month, the revised and updated version of my little primer, We Need to Talk About Putin, a perfect little stocking filler for everyone who might be vaguely interested in Russia. It doesn't have more than a few hours to learn about it.
And very relevant given our discussions, not just today, but over the last months, of course. Pleasure to speak to you, Mark. Thank you. Mark Galeotti, Russia expert, Sunday Times columnist, former Foreign Office advisor. Great to have you with us.
Let's speak to John Luff, who's head of foreign policy at the New Eurasian Strategies Centre and a former NATO representative in Moscow. Good evening, John.
Good evening.
There's obviously a huge amount of focus and concentration on what's happening in Ukraine. What are your takeaways from the movement that has happened today?
On the face of it, it does look like a quite significant development because the EU and the US seem to be aligned with Ukraine on what's needed to secure Ukraine's future as a viable, sovereign, independent state. But I think the problem they're going to hit now is they're going to take this to the Russians, and the Russians are going to want to rewrite huge chunks of what was agreed today, because there are a number of things there that cross the Russian red lines, notably the type of security guarantees that the EU and the US have in mind that would effectively involve putting forces from European and countries and the US on the ground in Ukraine. I think there's going to be a lot of difficulty around agreeing a verification mechanism for the ceasefire and the possible demilitarization of the front lines. So you can see all those problems emerging, and the Russians said pretty clearly at the weekend they know that they're not going to like what they'll see from the US and the EU. So I think we're going another round. But what for me is really striking is that for the first time, the United States has said that they are open to a treaty-based mechanism to guarantee Ukraine's security. So that's really very strong language. And for Ukraine, I think this opens the path, in fact, to reconciling themselves to the fact that they can't hold some of that territory, or they will be forced effectively to give up some of that territory they currently hold in Donbass.
Do you think that will happen then? Because that appears to be a major sticking point for Volodymyr Zelensky. He looks almost resigned to accepting that the already ceded territory is lost, but he is sticking very, very hard to not wanting to give any more to Russia.
Yeah, of course he is, for obvious reasons. But I think this is where a compromise, if a compromise is going to be found at all, it's going to be around the fact that Ukraine has to give up possibly a little bit of territory in Donbass, but then receive something very substantial in return. I mean, that's the only way it could possibly be sold.
And so substantial is something which basically contains Russia for the good of the Western world, which, of course, Russia has no interest in agreeing to right now.
Well, indeed, this is where the problem lies, because if there is a credible security mechanism there and Ukraine's security can be preserved, then the country can be rebuilt. And it can effectively offer a different form of governance to Russia, which is the one thing that I think Putin and those close to him wish to prevent at all costs. So, in other words, this confrontation would probably continue in a different form. But if Ukraine can develop peacefully and successfully, then this war will have been worth fighting. I think that's what historians of the future would probably say. But we're still, I think, very far from seeing this sort of arrangement actually thrashed out and then put into diplomatic language, let alone implemented.
The military intelligence axis of the United Kingdom has been on manoeuvres very recently, and you heard that clip from, the first public speech from the new head of MI6, Blaise Machiavelli. She wanted to focus purely on Russia. We are getting the sense that Russia is going to start looming very, very large in our immediate thoughts and in the thoughts of the defence minister next year, possibly spilling over into public problems. What are your thoughts on, I must say, Blaise Machiavelli has the most spy name ever, and she's got a very interesting look about her, but the content of her talk I thought was really interesting. She didn't take questions afterwards. She just focused on Russia relentlessly. What are your thoughts on what she said?
Well, I've only heard the clip, to be honest. I've been looking at other things today, but I think it's pretty predictable in some ways what she was saying, because this concern about Russia has been building for a long time. And I think somebody in her position wants to make it absolutely clear to both the government and the public that Russia is a long-term problem that is causing us difficulties right now.